Hi, my name is Ainsley Samples, and this is part two of the oral exam about Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So, what is RAWA, or AKA Recovering America's Wildlife Act? So, RAWA is a bill that has been presented to the House of Representatives originally in 2016, but several times since has been reintroduced and has ultimately failed to pass in the Senate. The House of Representatives has passed it several times, and every time the Senate gets it, it seems to die. This most recently happened in 2023. So, what the bill is it's a supplemental amendment to the Pittman-Robertson Act. The Pittman-Robertson Act, in short, takes the revenue, it's an extra tax on hunting, fishing, and hunting related like gear and things like that. And it takes that supplemental tax money and funnels it back into states' conservation. So like all state hunting and fishing licenses have Pittman, all of those funds are essentially um, go towards a state's conservation. Now, what RAWA does, or would have done potentially, is put forth 1.4 billion with a B dollars in extra funding for states, tribes, and United States territories to be used in conservation efforts. And so that would basically increase the amount of Pittman-Robertson Act funds that states have access to. So under RAWA, states would match federal funding at 25%. So if states get $1 million, they would have to match 25% of that $1 million of their own funds. And specifically, 20, wrong, so sorry. $97 million of the $1.4 billion that was to be allotted is specifically going to tribal protections of species of concern. So that would be going to like Native American communities and their conservation efforts. Um, Also, RAWA would have established a temporary endangered species recovery and habitat conservation legacy fund. So that would have been the United States Department of Treasury through 2027 would have give 187,500,000. Whew, what a number in grants for conservation activities to states. So, in short, that's what RAWA is. That's a little bit of an overview. We're going to get more into it. So, who sponsors the bill? Well, ultimately, let me move this little thing at the bottom of my screen so I can see. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Oops, sorry. Oopsies. I'm so sorry. Technical difficulties here. Okay, who sponsors the bill? So RAWA is a bipartisan bill and has gained a lot of support for House of Representatives and in the Senate, so it's a surprise to me. Ultimately, that didn't pass. But it has support from both sides of the aisle, so let's talk about it. Martin Heinrich is a Democrat from New Mexico, and he is the primary sponsor of RAWA and has been the primary sponsor of RAWA. So he has a long-standing history of working to increase funding in New Mexico for conservationists and especially like emergency personnel, so fire staff, things of that nature. And he also supports these efforts like nationally. So he has a long-standing record in conservation. Also, Roy Blunt he's a Republican from Missouri. He is a lead co-sponsor of RAWA, and he is a champion for bipartisan reform of America's wildlife policies before he ultimately retired in 2023. But he, again, was a primary sponsor of this bill. Uh, so that's just a general overview. It is a bipartisan bill, and it had a lot of support and had a lot of traction for a really long time. Um, so what it eventually boiled down to is the Senate opposed the fact that they didn't really know where the money was coming from, which is kind of crazy because we know where the money would come from, right? So environmental lawsuits in the United States in 2024, fiscal year 2024, racked up 1.7 billion with a B dollars in EPA policy violations from private entities. So um, that leaves an extra $300 million to spare after the full funding of RAWA. So, again, not exactly sure where the confusion was on the Senate's part, but they were confused nonetheless. Um, the senators in the 118th Congress did not pass the bill or even really vote on it because of the supposed insecure funding sources. And that was pretty much the main opposition from politicians, but also some opposition from the public is that hunting and fishing, there's a specific demographic of hunting and fishing folks who don't want their funds going towards non-game conservation, but that's the vast minority of hunters and fishermen. Um, Also, uh, Pittman-Robertson Act allocation. So 15% of the Pittman-Robertson Act funds would be allocated to support non-game conservation efforts. Again, this amendment ultimately would amend the Pittman-Robertson Act, so it would be changing the allotment of those funds. And those statistics are from the Environmental Protection Agency in 2024. So where are we now with RAWA? So not with RAWA, but just with grants in general, right? Because obviously we know where we are with RAWA. But state and tribal wildlife grants act similarly to how RAWA would have acted if it had been passed, and they provide federal funding to non-federal government land management agencies. So primarily states, tribes, and territories, again, will get state and tribal wildlife grants, and they typically focus on species of greatest conservation need with these grants. And all of this is funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so it is not a separate allocated funding source. It is actually it is a budget that is budgeted into an agency's, overall fiscal year budget. Um, so SWAP, moving on, is state wildlife action plans. And these are long-term planned operations that are set out by each individual state. And they're set out typically by the conservation agency in that state. So think like Missouri DNR, Georgia DNR, those type of things. Um, and they essentially plan and coordinate habitat management and species recovery, endangered species management, invasive species management, all sorts of things. And it plans for the long term. So STWGs, they actually fund swaps. I know this is a lot of jargon lingo, but hopefully I've explained it well enough. But the state wildlife action plans are ultimately funded by state and tribal wildlife grants for the most part. Obviously, the states do put their own budget in as well, but there are a lot of grants, especially federal grants involved. RAWA would have acted a little bit differently from the budgeting side of the house in the fact that the revenue is from the government itself, and is not actually being taken out of taxpayer dollars. Would have been solely funded by fees and fines from, already like environmental policy breaches, essentially. So it would have been a little bit different. But ultimately, it would have focused on non-game species management instead of game species management. So, STWGs in action. So, Georgia's State Wildlife Action Plan has many programs. Just like other states, we're not unique in this. The specifically state and tribal wildlife grants have provided Georgia with the ability to acquire over 100,000 acres of land, and dedicate that to conservation, as well as manage 300,000 acres in conservation easements and joint management with private landowners. So that's huge in Georgia. The Georgia Forestry Commission does a lot with private landowners, and primarily, again, grants from the federal government fund a lot of this work. Also, Georgia has a lot of endangered and threatened species. Specifically, the loggerhead sea turtle has a pretty solid recovery plan listed in our SWAP. So that is just an example of one of 640 species that are listed as high conservation concern in Georgia. So ultimately, Georgia DNR, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, is primarily the manager of the Georgia SWAP. Again, there are other agencies, but Georgia DNR does most of the work. And the idea behind our swap is to keep common wildlife common, is so to catch declining populations of common species, instead of trying to recover them once they're already threatened, endangered, or rare. So, a direct quote from the Georgia DNR website is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think that that rings true. So, state and tribal wildlife grants have allocated over $20 million in federal funding to Georgia since 2005, or since 2000, the implementation of it in 2000. Um, and ultimately, if RAWA had passed, it would have significantly increased the amount of state and tribal wildlife grants, as well as the amount of overall funding that Georgia Department of Natural Resources and Georgia Forestry Commission and other conservation agencies across the nation would have gotten. And that would have primarily allowed us to tackle, again, catching species before they are uh, listed as species of greatest conservation need, and maybe stay ahead of the curve as far as that goes. But with all the talk of, I know, the government shutdown and, working on in conservation is kind of, it can be kind of crazy sometimes. So where do we go? What do we do? If this is not going to get passed and had bipartisan support, what is going to get passed? And the honest answer is we don't really know. The 119th Congress is the Congress that we have right now, and it has not been presented with any version of RAWA. Um, since the 119th Congress has been sworn in, there's really not been much bipartisan legislation that has been passed, especially not as of late, because they are very much tied up with trying to come up with a bipartisan support for our budget as the federal government. Um, so there have been no mentions from current sponsors on a reintroduction of RAWA, and that would have to be done before the end of term and passed before the end of term in 2026. So we really are not sure. RAWA in and of itself is kind of dead in the water until it gets represented to Congress and passes both the House and the Senate again. So, other limitations and criticisms to RAWA, obviously, no bill is perfect, and it's hard to get a unanimous vote on anything. Um, RAWA is no exception to that. So, RAWA's original purpose is to allocate funds to land management agencies to catch species in decline. There are critics that say we should already be funding this type of work and that endangered species should be our priority, which, in my opinion, if you read RAWA, it definitely did not leave endangered species out. It actually specifically mentions endangered species, but that's just some common criticisms that I found. Also, critics of the bill say that equal funding should be given to endangered and threatened species as well as species of non-concern, essentially. So, that's just some common criticisms and some members of the public who maybe are not as big of supporters of RAWA as others. So ultimately, how could RAWA help us? It could help Georgia, and how can it help beyond? Georgia's not in a unique situation in being underfunded and understaffed in conservation. Land management across the board in our nation is consistently and constantly being cut, undermined, and just underdealt with, in my opinion. Um, the passage of RAWA would have been huge. It would have increased a lot of funding in programs similar to state and tribal wildlife grants. It would have given us a lot more funding on the state level, but also it would have given us a lot of federal support. So a lot of the things us as the federal government are not allowed to do, the states are, and it takes intense collaboration with state agencies. And unfortunately, there are a lot of state agencies and a lot of federal agencies that are losing the manpower to even be able to collaborate and get work done. I feel like RAWA definitely would have combated that. There was a statistic that said that 33,000 jobs would have been created by the passage of RAWA, and I think that that would have been awesome. Uh, Ultimately, I think that RAWA would have changed conservation nationwide, and I think it would have changed it for the better. It definitely would have given more money to conservation agencies, and money is power in the conservation world. So I hope that that explains things well, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening and enjoy.